The city was waking up, though there was a quiet that felt unfamiliar for this hour. In Midtown Manhattan at first light, the streets were brushed in pale gold as the sun began its rise, and long avenues stretched between towering buildings whose glass faces caught the color of dawn. Few cars had begun to thread through the avenues yet, and the rumble that usually defined this part of the city had not fully taken hold. The air was crisp, cold enough to make a jacket a necessary companion, and a thin breath of wind curled around street corners and through alleyways as if testing the morning's silence. For the commuters who had started their routines, baristas unlocking doors for early customers, porters wheeling carts toward hotels, and the occasional jogger tracing a path around Central Park, the day's opening sequence felt ordinary. The sidewalk creaked under the weight of a garbage truck making its rounds, and distant honks hinted at the city's expanding motion. But the whole scene carried a stillness you could sense in the space between footsteps. Here, at this early hour, Manhattan didn't feel dangerous. It didn't feel like a backdrop for headlines or fear. It felt like it always had. Urgent, alive, and operating on its own quiet rhythm before the world fully appeared. People were going about their routines, unlocking bicycles, brewing coffee, reading the morning news on glowing screens, unaware that something was set to interrupt this ordinary start. On this morning, every moment felt normal enough that, if you'd asked someone to describe how the day began, they'd have told you it was just another start in a city that never truly sleeps. But within this routine, light was touching every surface with deceptive calm. And if you'd stop to think about it, to slow your pace and look, you might have sensed that this particular beginning was somehow different. And yet no alarm had sounded, no siren had split the air. The calm was intact, unchanging and unremarkable to most. In that sense, the morning was utterly ordinary, and that was what made what came next so unthinkable. On a morning like this, pale light under grey skies, half-empty sidewalks, brisk winds slipping between towering facades, a man named Brian Thompson moved through the city without attracting more than a glance. Most people on that quiet stretch of West 54th Street had no idea who he was, and he walked with an unhurried purpose that could have belonged to any business traveler making his way to a meeting. Yet beneath his calm exterior was a life shaped by decades of discipline, routine, and dedication to family and work that few outside his closest circles fully understood. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Bedtime Black Files, where life's most powerful lessons are revealed through unforgettable true crime events from around the world. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If you're stepping into our community for the first time, I'm truly glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. Before we get into it, consider hitting the subscribe button. Don't forget to like and share this video with someone who needs it. Your support helps our family grow, connect, and keep these powerful stories alive. Brian Robert Thompson was 50 years old. He had been born in a small rural community in Iowa, where open fields and simple rhythms taught him early on the value of effort and responsibility. He excelled throughout school, earning degrees in business administration and accounting before entering the professional world with a seriousness of purpose that carried him from a modest start into the highest echelons of corporate leadership. For more than 2 decades, Thompson devoted himself to UnitedHealthcare, the insurance division of a vast healthcare corporation. He had joined the company in 2004 and steadily moved through roles of increasing responsibility, eventually being named Chief Executive Officer in 2021. In that position, he oversaw operations affecting tens of millions of Americans, guiding policy decisions and large strategic shifts in how the company delivered health benefits. At home in the leafy suburbs of Minnesota near Minneapolis, who was a father first, Thompson shared his life with his wife, Paulette, often called Paulie, and their 2 sons, now young adults on the brink of their own independent lives. Friends and colleagues remembered him as someone who balanced a demanding professional life with genuine care for his family, attending his children's events when time allowed, and offering steady support and encouragement through the highs and lows that come with adolescence. Despite the responsibilities and pressures of leading one of the nation's most influential healthcare firms, those who knew him personally spoke of a man who preferred simplicity when he could find it. Someone who enjoyed a quiet breakfast with family before setting out for the day. Someone who valued predictability in his routine, and someone whose grounded presence made even serious conversations feel measured and calm. So on this early December morning, as a chill clung to Manhattan air and daybreak stretched across the avenues, Brian walked, as he almost always did before meetings, purposeful, composed, and unaware of how this particular ordinary moment was about to break every expectation he'd ever had for a routine morning. Brian Robert Thompson's path from Midwestern classrooms to the corner offices of a fortune-level enterprise began long before he navigated Manhattan streets on that cold December morning. He was born on July 10th, 1974, in Ames, a modest community in the heart of Iowa, where wide skies and fields drifting toward the horizon framed a simpler version of American life. In a place where neighbors knew one another's names and ambitions were measured in hard work rather than flash, Thompson learned early the value of diligence, focus, and quiet determination. As a youth, he stood out not for flamboyance, but for steadiness. In his hometown near Jewel Junction, he excelled in classroom and extracurricular pursuits alike, becoming valedictorian of his high school class in 1993, a distinction earned through consistent effort and intellectual curiosity. Those early years revealed the pattern that would define his career, an unassuming drive to master whatever challenges lay before him. After high school, Thompson remained rooted in his home state as he enrolled at the University of Iowa. There he pursued a bachelor's degree in business administration, with an emphasis on accounting, completing his studies in 1997 with top academic honors. The education he received in economics, financial systems, and leadership provided the technical foundation for the next phase of his professional life, and the discipline he applied to his studies became a repeatable habit in every role he undertook. Upon graduation, Thompson took his first professional step into the world of finance, joining PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the world's most respected accounting and business advisory firms. Over 7 years with the company, he advanced to the role of manager, specializing in strategy, transactions, and complex financial services. His reputation for precision, sound judgment, and thorough preparation grew in these years, and colleagues came to rely on his ability to navigate complicated fiscal terrain without fuss or theatrics. Still, his ambitions reached beyond the traditional audit room. In 2004, Thompson accepted an opportunity with UnitedHealth Group, a sprawling enterprise whose reach touched millions of lives across the United States through insurance services and health programs. Starting in executive roles focused on the company's government programs, he oversaw operations linked to Medicare and Medicaid, areas fraught with regulatory complexity and public scrutiny. In this environment, his aptitude for thoughtful leadership and operational clarity became immediately evident. Over the years that followed, Thompson's responsibilities expanded as he moved into positions requiring broader strategic vision. By the time he was appointed Chief Executive Officer of UnitedHealthcare in April 2021, he had spent nearly 2 decades blending financial savvy with an ability to manage large organizations and diverse teams. Under his leadership, the division's operations reached new scales of service, touching the lives of tens of millions who depended on the company's frameworks for access to health coverage. Even as he rose through corporate ranks, Thompson seldom sought the spotlight. His approach remained grounded in the self-discipline and thoughtful decision-making he had cultivated in his earliest Iowa days. For him, success was not a grand announcement, but a steady sequence of well-executed steps toward goals that were professional, personal, and deeply connected to the rhythms of everyday life. The rhythm of Brian Thompson's life was shaped as much by habit as by ambition. Early rising was second nature to him, a pattern that had begun decades earlier in small towns and kept pace with him as he ascended corporate ladders and stepped into meeting after meeting anchored by precision and preparation. Even in boardrooms, where leaders often thrived on performance and flair, Thompson did not seek attention. He was serious without being stern, measured without being cold, a presence defined more by thoughtful consideration than sharp posturing. Those who worked with him on UnitedHealthcare's complex portfolios, from Medicare and retirement programs to broader national coverage initiatives, often remarked that he approached challenges the same way he approached mornings: calm, methodical, and orderly. He would begin each day before sunrise, reviewing schedules and correspondence, while the rest of the world still gathered steam. His desk in the sprawling corporate campus outside Minneapolis was kept in tidy order, with documents placed according to function and purpose rather than spectacle. At home, it was much the same. Friends noted that he enjoyed simplicity in domestic life: a carefully brewed cup of coffee, conversation with his wife Paulette about the day ahead, or quiet moments with his sons before they departed for their routines, whether classes, work, or errands. The weekdays followed a pattern that was almost reassuring in its predictability, and weekends were similarly structured around family time, errands, and the little details that make a house feel like a home. When Thompson traveled for work, as he was doing on this particular morning in Manhattan, he maintained the same personal checklist. He would wake early in his hotel room, tie his shoes with practiced precision, sip the coffee made just right, and check emails with an almost habitual thoroughness. Then he would venture out into a city still folding night into day, blending into the movement of others without drawing notice. This sense of order was not habitual rigidity. It was part of who he was, a man grounded in routine, dependable in action, and at ease with structure even amid the unpredictability of modern executive life. And yet, as calm and deliberate as his outside demeanor appeared, his leadership carried weighty responsibilities that brought constant pressure. Decisions affecting millions of lives and billions of dollars were not made lightly, and his colleagues often described him as someone who carried that responsibility with quiet seriousness. The predictable rhythm of his routines, both personal and professional, was less about comfort and more about intentional preparation for whatever the workday demanded. On that early Manhattan sidewalk, as the city's pulse grew stronger with each passing minute, no one would have guessed how completely that sense of predictability was about to be shattered. But in that moment, Brian Thompson walked as he almost always had, steady, composed, and shaped by a lifetime of structured living that had brought him here, to this routine, on this particular morning. Even as Brian Thompson's life was meticulously ordered by routines and responsibilities, the world around him was growing louder, not in the quiet streets of Midtown Manhattan on that early morning, but in forums, boardrooms, and news cycles, where healthcare policy had become a battleground. Thompson had reached the summit of his profession as the Chief Executive Officer of UnitedHealthcare, the insurance arm of a healthcare conglomerate larger than many national economy. But with that power came a degree of public scrutiny few executives ever faced. Under his leadership, UnitedHealthcare had become a focal point of national debate over the role of private insurers in a system where coverage, costs, and access to care were constantly in question. Critics, including consumer advocates, lawmakers, and patients, regularly challenged UnitedHealthcare's approach to claims and coverage. One of the recurring complaints was that the company's policies on prior authorization and claims review had grown more stringent, leaving families frustrated when necessary care was delayed or denied. Reports by independent journalists and investigations by government committees pointed to higher rates of prior authorization denials for Medicare Advantage enrollees, provoking questions about whether profit motives were at odds with patient well-being. These controversies were not abstract. The Senate Homeland Security Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations issued a report in late 2024 showing significant increases in denials of requests for treatment among Medicare Advantage patients, a finding that thrust UnitedHealthcare and similar insurers into the spotlight. In response, the company faced legislative hearings, public comment, and calls for reform that would not fade with a shift of headlines. Beyond policy criticisms, Thompson's tenure had also intersected with legal challenges. In mid-2024, a group of firefighters' pension funds in Florida had filed a lawsuit alleging that United Health Group's leadership, including Thompson, sold significant stock holdings while privately aware of a Department of Justice antitrust investigation. Plaintiffs accused the executives of misinforming shareholders by not disclosing the full nature of regulatory scrutiny, a claim that added another layer of pressure on a company already contending with intense public debate. On social media and in everyday conversations, frustrations with the healthcare system often found a human outlet in stories of denied claims, financial burdens from uncovered treatments, and the complex bureaucracy that defines so many patients' experiences. Polls conducted after the December shooting later revealed that a majority of Americans believed healthcare coverage denial and insurance profits played a role in the climate of anger directed at UnitedHealthcare's leadership. For Thompson, this underlying tension was part of his lived reality. He knew that if an executive's actions could affect millions of people's access to care, then leaders would have to balance financial stewardship with public expectations. And on that chilly morning in Manhattan, he walked toward his schedule with that balance on his mind, fully aware of both the routine and the weight it carried. Despite the public disputes and mounting scrutiny, there was no denying Thompson's success. Under his leadership, UnitedHealthcare had expanded its reach, steered growth, and maintained its status as the largest health insurer in the United States. He had emerged from the quiet fields of Iowa to stand at the helm of a corporate titan, managing a network that covered tens of millions of lives, while guiding strategic shifts in how healthcare financing took shape in the modern era. Yet behind those measurable achievements lay a subtle tension between public perception and private responsibility. In press releases and investor briefings, his work was described as visionary and forward-looking. But in dinner table conversations and online comment threads, his company's policies were the subject of raw frustration. Ordinary Americans facing mounting medical costs and complex claims battles often saw in UnitedHealthcare's decisions a system tilted toward profit rather than care. And then there were the questions that hovered over every boardroom and newsroom discussing his name. What if the most dangerous moment of your life looked completely ordinary? What if a routine morning, a breakfast, a brief walk to a meeting, a simple commute, was all someone needed to walk into history? What if influence and achievement could make a life visible on spreadsheets and intangible in conversations, but invisible in terms of personal risk until the moment it was too late to change course? These questions swirled quietly in the backdrops of public debate, prompting reflections on the unseen forces that tie power to vulnerability. Viewers and readers alike, those accustomed to routine mornings, coffees by the window, pre-meeting checklists, were invited to reflect on their own unremarkable beginnings before life's unexpected turning points. What unseen pressures gather in the margins of ordinary days? What unseen hazards might unfold in plain sight? And as you, watching or listening to this story, ponder who would want a man like this dead, and why, it matters to pause for a moment, take stock of your own everyday routines, and consider how swiftly and quietly ordinary life can shift into something unforgettable. Before we continue deeper into the narrative that follows that morning, take a moment to reflect. If this story has drawn you in this far, consider subscribing, because real-life cases don't feel real until they are. Luigi Nicholas Mangione was not a name that would draw attention on a college diploma, yet for a period of his life, it represented the promise of achievement and possibility. Born in 1998 in Towson, Maryland, Mangione grew up in a household where academic success and social standing went hand in hand. From an early age, his path appeared well-lit, strong performance in school, praise from teachers, and the quiet expectation that he would follow through on the potential he showed. In high school, Mangione's intellect earned recognition. He graduated as valedictorian and carried the traits of a student accustomed to academic challenges. He went on to enroll at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the nation's most esteemed institutions, where he pursued an engineering education that combined both breadth and depth. At Penn, he earned dual degrees, a Bachelor of Science in Engineering and a Master of Science in Engineering, a path few students completed so early in life. To peers and faculty, Mangione came across as thoughtful, analytical, and earnest in his pursuits. Professors assigned projects that drew on mathematical reasoning, coding, and systems design, and Mangione tackled them with a seriousness befitting someone comfortable with complexity. His academic portfolio reflected intelligence, precision, and a disciplined engagement with subjects that demanded relentless attention and rigor. Outside the lecture halls, his status as an Ivy League graduate carried a quiet prestige. A degree from Penn suggested a future bright with opportunity and doors at the highest levels of industry. Yet beneath the surface, traits that once propelled Mangione toward this promise would later reveal fault lines that few could have predicted. Those who knew Mangione during college recalled a young man who spoke little but listened intently. He was quiet without being aloof, focused without appearing distracted, and highly capable without displaying arrogance. Some described him as reserved, others as introspective. In a world where self-promotion often dominated, Mangione stood apart, not shy, but privately, driven by curiosity and ideas, rather than social acclaim. After graduation, however, the pattern of his life began to shift. Rather than moving directly into a steady career aligned with his credentials, Mangione spent time exploring different ways of living. Friends noted periods of withdrawal from structured work, and in those quiet moments alone he began engaging with material that deviated from the mainstream. What had once been a mind attentive to engineering theories became drawn toward readings that critiqued societal systems and cast doubt on centralized power. As months passed, Mangione's circle thinned. He wandered across cities and communities, at times living away from familiar environments. While younger adults often seek variety and independence after college, the intensity with which Mangione embraced isolation was pronounced. Conversations that once covered shared interests gradually became laced with his growing fixation on the perceived flaws of systems he saw as oppressive or unjust. Gradually his world narrowed into a viewpoint framed less by collaboration and more by critique. Ideas that might have once been contained to intellectual debate began to shape a growing internal narrative, one in which he saw himself not merely as a critic of society, but as a judge of its institutions and their leader. This transformation was quiet at first, But by the time the events of late 2024 unfolded, that shift had become decisive. When Mangione was taken into custody in Pennsylvania in early December 2024, authorities uncovered a notebook in his possession that they later described as a handwritten document outlining his views on the American healthcare system and corporate power. In the words he penned, scribbled across pages in tight, earnest handwriting, Mangione laid out a critique of what he perceived as systemic imbalance, an industry built for profit at the expense of people. The document was later published in full by independent journalists and confirmed by law enforcement as authentic. Although Mangione did not explicitly outline a plan of action in that manifesto, he did express a disdain for corporate structures that he believed contributed to widespread hardship. In his writing, he criticized health insurance systems, framing his argument in moral terms and questioning the legitimacy of leaders who oversaw systems he viewed as unjust. To investigators, this document offered a window into the emotional landscape that had taken hold of his thinking, one where his belief in a flawed system grew into a conviction strong enough to eclipse more conventional paths, goals, and social connections. It was a belief rooted in frustration and criticism, not grounded in personal history with the companies he denounced, but galvanized by abstract ideas of grievance and retribution. Nothing in Mangione's official record prepared law enforcement or those who knew him for what would come next. Prior to his arrest in December 2024, he had no known criminal history, no documented record of violence, and no encounters with police that would have marked him as a danger to others. His background, by all conventional standards, was unremarkable beyond academic distinction. This lack of prior incidents made the escalation of his actions all the more surprising. A young man driven by study and introspection, a graduate of a top university, someone previously described as polite and cooperative, had transformed into the central figure in one of the most high-profile violent attacks of the year. To friends who spoke about him after the arrest, the contrast was stark. R.J. Martin, a former roommate, told reporters that Mangione had never shown signs of aggression or capability for violence during their time living together, a sentiment echoed by others who had encountered him in casual settings. And yet, here he was, at the center of a manhunt and murder investigation that gripped a nation. If Mangione's life story had a single theme until late 2024, it was that of quiet achievement. Friends, classmates, and colleagues described him in terms that underscored normalcy rather than threat. He was bookish, ambitious, reflective, someone whose deepest fears might have been theoretical disagreements or intellectual challenges rather than harm to another person. Many who saw his mugshots or images from court could not reconcile the calm face with the gravity of the charges against him. He didn't look like someone capable of violence, one acquaintance said, a phrase repeated across social media and news coverage. Witness after witness, from roommates to classmates, echoed the same disbelief, struggling to connect the dots between the person they knew and the act he was accused of committing. This contrast between expectation and action became a central theme in public discussions. Analysts, psychologists, and criminologists weighed in, offering explanations that ranged from cognitive dissonance to sociological pressure to psychological isolation. But at the heart of it all was a question that many found unsettling. How could someone with such a quiet past reach such a violent point without any clear announcement of intent? And this is where the narrative becomes less about facts alone and more about interpretation, inviting reflection from those hearing the story. Have you ever looked at someone and completely misjudged who they really were? Consider the classmates who saw Mangione walk into lecture halls with a notebook under his arm. Consider the friends who shared meals and jokes with him, unaware of the storm of ideas building beneath his calm exterior. Consider the interviewers who signed his academic degrees and expected a future of innovation rather than infamy. In ordinary life, we tend to assume continuity in people, that who they have been will continue to be who they are. We trust in patterns, in reputations, in familiar faces. But when patterns diverge, they can do so without leaving readable signals. And in Mangione's case, that divergence led to an outcome no one ever suspected. This doesn't mean transformation is impossible or rare, but it does highlight a truth that is hard to accept. Even the most educated, composed, and unremarkable individuals, on the surface, can change in ways that are deeply unfamiliar to those around them. So ask yourself this: when you look at someone, how confident are you that you truly see who they have become? What drove Mangione to embrace such intense internal conviction? It was not a single moment, nor a simple trigger, but a gradual reshaping of how he understood the world. The notebook he carried, the ideas he consumed, and the isolation he embraced all point to a process, one of internal transformation. This transformation was not sudden. Friends observed a gradual shift from engaging in academic debate to dwelling on the flaws of institutions he viewed as unjust. What once may have been casual dissatisfaction turned into stark judgment. What once might have been philosophical debate became a framework through which he saw all systems, institutions, and leaders. Viewed from the outside, this transformation might seem unfathomable, but from within, it emerged in every moment. Mangione chose certain paths over others. Paths that eventually isolated him further from conventional support systems and brought him closer to an internal narrative that justified his grievances. In understanding this internal shift, it becomes clear that the journey was not about sudden violence, but about a series of choices, intellectual, emotional, and personal, that redirected his life into an unexpected and tragic direction. The trajectory of Luigi Mangione's life raises a compelling question, one that goes beyond any single act of violence and reaches into the way we perceive the people around us. If someone can shift from quiet achievement and promise to extreme action without overt signals, then how many paths might be hiding behind composed faces, polite greetings, and well-chosen words? Do you think people show signs before something like this, or not? Take a moment and reflect on that, because as this story unfolds, that question will return again and again, challenging assumptions about warning signs, human transformation, and the shadows that can form in quiet places. Comment your thoughts. What do you see now that you didn't before? On the evening of November 24th, 2024, a man arriving in Midtown Manhattan blended into a long line of travelers stepping off a late-night Greyhound bus at the Port Authority terminal. It was nearly 10:11 p.m. when surveillance captured his arrival. Ordinary travel footage that, under any other circumstances, would have gone unnoticed. But this man was not simply another visitor to New York City. He came with a purpose that had been forming in his mind for many weeks. He carried a fake identity, a forged New Jersey driver's license bearing the name Mark Rosario. With that alias in hand, he hailed a taxi and made his way north, a purposeful figure against streets that throbbed with the city's nocturnal rhythm. In the shadow of skyscrapers and the ceaseless flow of traffic, he checked into the high New York City hostel on the Upper West Side, choosing anonymity over comfort and blending into the diverse mix of backpackers, tourists, and nightly commuters populating the neighborhood. At the front desk, his mask slipped only once, briefly and without ceremony, momentarily revealing the face of someone who would soon become one of the most wanted men in the country. After that, he kept his hood raised in public areas and spoke sparingly, making sure conversations were limited to what was necessary, and never more. In the communal living space of the hostel, he moved quietly, keeping to himself, as other guests came and went, unaware of the intent behind his presence. Over the next few days, the same pattern continued. He extended his reservation, payment after payment, avoiding long conversations and absorbing nothing of the casual friendships forming around him. At times, he lingered in the lobby, tucked away in a seat near a window, face half hidden beneath the brim of a hat, eyes shifting across news feeds and travel routes, as though cataloguing details others failed to see. Outside, the city's noise pulsed. Taxis, food carts, evening crowds. But inside the hostel, his world stayed quiet and focused, mapped onto a sequence of times and places he had memorized and replayed in his mind. In this city of rapid motion, he was a still point, a calculated presence in a place where millions carried on without hesitation. On the face of it, his arrival on November 24th was just the start of another visitor's journey through New York's sprawling urban grid. But far from ordinary, this arrival marked the first chapter of a deliberate plan, one that would unfold in the days ahead with precision and attention, away from the gaze of daily commuters and the press that would later recount every step of that trajectory. On the morning of December 4th, 2024, the approach Luigi Mangione took to his plan was methodical, almost ritualistic in its quiet precision, long before he stepped onto the sidewalk across from the New York Hilton Midtown, where Brian Thompson would later arrive. Mangione had spent hours observing the rhythms of that block in Midtown Manhattan. The night before, leaving the high New York City hostel in the pre-dawn gray, he had taken the same streets so many times already that his movements suggested rehearsal rather than happenstance. At approximately 5:34 a.m. on December 4th, Mangione left the hostel and rode his electric bicycle toward the hotel district, carrying a simple backpack that contained the tools he had chosen for his plan. He pedaled with a calm, unhurried pace as the early morning light crept across 6th Avenue, aware that he had already been here before, that he knew the sequence of blocks, the angles of streetlight, reflections on steel and glass, and the cadence of the city just before it fully stirred. By 5:41 a.m., surveillance cameras captured Mangione walking along West 54th Street, not far from the Hilton. He looped his route back and forth, sometimes crossing the sidewalk, sometimes pacing between the parked cars and the entrance he had fixed in his mind as the point where his plan would unfold. Observers later noted that police believe he had studied Thompson's likely path, cross-referencing publicly available information about the CEO's conference locations and schedules with the physical geography of this block, riding his bicycle early enough to both familiarize himself with the scene and wait without drawing obvious attention. Despite the brisk December air, Mangione's movements reflected a certain calm precision, a quiet, repetitive pattern where he stepped off the curb, scanned across the street, and then moved again toward the next corner. Then he would pause, eyes following the avenue's curve, as if part of his preparation involved memorizing how long it took for a subway train's rumble to fade into silence, or how the first bus of the morning found its way up 7th Avenue. When he reached a point where he could see the north entrance of the Hilton from across the street, he lingered, adjusting the hood on his jacket, settling into a waiting position that would become crucial to the moments that followed. For nearly an hour he remained in this state, stepping forward several feet, then stepping back, shifting weight from one foot to the other, folding and refolding his arms. These were not the motions of someone acting on impulse, but rather the gestures of someone rehearsing patience, refining presence without urgency. As other early risers began to trickle down isolated blocks, but yet to be revealed, Mangione's focus never wavered. He was attuned to the echo of footsteps, the slight shift in wind off Central Park, even the dim glow of neon signs flickering as morning approached. Every minute seemed an opportunity to attune himself further to the scene he had quietly chosen, not as a bystander, but as someone who had calculated the significance of each step he took that morning. In those pre-sunrise minutes, the quiet repetition of Mangione's movements, walking slightly ahead and then circling back, lingering in sightlines he believed would offer the best vantage, created a tableau of preparation that stood in ominous contrast to the routine bustle of the awakening city. It was a waiting game of his own making, an embrace of stillness that hid intention beneath a layer of near invisibility. For 5 days, before the early morning encounter outside the New York Hilton Midtown, Luigi Mangione's behavior reflected a contrast stark enough to capture investigators' attention, and later formed the basis of prosecutors' descriptions of his plan. On one hand, Mangione moved with calm resolve, his steps measured, his actions unhurried, his routine so quiet that a casual observer could assume he was simply another visitor navigating the city before daylight. On the other hand, that calm hid a singular purpose: to wait, to watch, and to strike at a moment he had chosen with deliberate care. This was not impetuous spontaneity. It was a deliberate expansion of intention that played out in silence. In the hours before dawn on December 4th, Mangione positioned himself near the hotel entrance and seemed at ease as early morning commuters made their way through Midtown Manhattan. He stood in sequence on the sidewalk, sometimes leaning against walls, other times stepping ahead only to return to the same spot, all the while attuning himself to the shifting background of the city waking up. Observers who later reviewed surveillance footage saw a person whose body language blended patience with precision, reinforcing the idea that he was not in a rush, but rather anchored in anticipation of a planned conclusion. This tension between calm preparation and brewing intention was sharpened the night before, when Mangione had been seen walking near the Hilton precinct just after 8 p.m. on December 3rd, days after his hostile arrival, without any apparent urgency. In footage reviewed by prosecutors, he walked past the hotel in the opposite direction from where he would position himself the next morning, phone in hand, and seemingly taking in details that others would overlook. That moment underscored a progression, from an individual arriving in the city with a quiet facade to someone studying a specific location for reasons he had not yet acted upon. In each passing hour, he rehearsed the quietness of his movements. He checked the pace of light on nearby buildings. He noted how long it took for the subway rumbles to fade into silence. He observed the cadence of early morning traffic on 6th Avenue. Each repetition, each subtle recalibration of posture and position, was a form of mental preparation that sharpened his resolve without drawing external attention. Yet beneath this stillness lay an internal calculus, the acceptance that a moment of extreme consequence was approaching. He had lived through ordinary days in New York before, but these final hours differed, at times almost hypnotically so, because his thoughts and actions were no longer shaped by ease or exploration. Instead, they were narrowed to focus entirely on when he would act. That internal narrowing of purpose, juxtaposed against an outwardly calm presence, created a tension that was as steady as it was unsettling, an invisible force that drove him closer to the choice he had made long before he stepped onto 54th Street that morning. In this quiet persistence, this repeated, almost ritualistic prelude to confrontation, we are confronted with a question that will echo through the events that follow. What's more terrifying, rage in the moment or patience over time? After leaving the high New York City hostel in the early hours of December 4th, 2024, and riding his electric bicycle toward Midtown Manhattan, Luigi Mangione executed a step in his plan that at first glance appeared almost banal. A quiet detour through the city's still waking streets that would later become a crucial clue in piecing together his movements. Surveillance footage captured Mangione arriving in the vicinity of 6th Avenue near West 54th Street well before dawn. Then, at approximately 6:15 a.m., a block or two away from the New York Hilton Midtown, he walked into a Starbucks cafe and purchased a bottle of water and granola bars, discarding the coffee cup and other packaging afterward. In the video, he appeared calm and composed as he waited in line, exchanged money for refreshments, and stepped back onto the sidewalk with his items in hand. Nothing about his posture or movement suggested that this brief pause would later be linked to an act that would shake the business world. It was a scene that, in isolation, could have belonged to any early morning visitor to the city, someone preparing for a long walk, a busy meeting, or simply the cold that defined midwinter mornings in Manhattan. To every casual observer, the stop at Starbucks was innocuous, a choice consistent with routine human behavior, not the behavior of someone on the verge of executing a deeply consequential plan. The water he bought would be carried only moments later to the very street where Brian Thompson would walk toward his scheduled meeting. The granola bars, equally ordinary, suggested nothing beyond a desire for sustenance in the hours before the world around him fully stirred. Yet this mundane action, framed by the predictable morning routines of countless commuters and visitors, now carried a new significance. Investigators later referenced the Starbucks stop as a key part of the timeline, evidence that Mangione was not rushing into his actions, but moving through the sequence of familiar tasks before he reached the place and moment he had zeroed in on. There was no hurried glance over the shoulder, no visible anxiety or jittery movement as he stepped from the cafe back onto the pavement. Instead, he joined the flow of early morning foot traffic with composed steps, continuing toward the hotel district, as though his errands in the city were no different from anyone else's. In that context, the Starbucks stop stands out not for anything dramatic that occurred inside the cafe, but for how ordinary it was in contrast to what was yet to unfold. A silent prelude to an event whose repercussions would ripple far beyond a Midtown sidewalk. Alongside the routine-looking items in his backpack, water bottles, granola bars, spare clothing, investigators found a weapon that would later become a focal point of both the criminal case and national discussion surrounding improvised firearms and homemade armaments. When Luigi Mangione was apprehended in Altoona, Pennsylvania on December 9, 2024, law enforcement discovered in his bag a 3D printed pistol accompanied by a 3D printed suppressor, the parts of the device that made it feasible for someone to possess and wield a firearm without a serial number or traceable origin, brandishing no serial markers. The typical means by which guns are catalogued, tracked, and regulated. The pistol and its attached suppressor were the sort of improvised firearm components often described in media and law enforcement reports as difficult to trace to a manufacturer. In the context of this investigation, the absence of a serial number signified not just a technical detail, but a deliberate choice consistent with the suspect's preparation to act without leaving a conventional trail. Ballistics analysis later confirmed that the components found in Mangione's possession were consistent with the weapon used to fire multiple shots at Brian Thompson outside the New York Hilton Midtown. 3 9mm shell casings recovered at the scene matched the type of ammunition the pistol was capable of firing, reinforcing the link between the improvised device and the fatal attack. The suppressor, sometimes called a silencer in public reporting, did not render the weapon silent, but it did reduce the auditory impact of the gunshot in the early morning street setting. This aspect of the device's construction suggested a level of forethought that bridged mere possession and tactical planning. The lure of such homemade firearms, assembled from digital designs and commercially available parts that bypass standard regulation, posed challenges not only to law enforcement but to broader conversations on weapon accessibility. Yet in the moments before the attack, there was nothing about the pistol's outward appearance its matte black finish, its unremarkable grip, its absence of overt markings that distinguished it from the background bustle of Midtown Manhattan. To passers-by, it was invisible, indistinguishable from the everyday objects carried by dozens of commuters. Its presence in Mangione's backpack was a quiet testament to how ordinary implements of daily life and meticulously hidden tools of violence can occupy the same space until the moment of action. In the half-light of December 4th, 2024, before dawn broke over Midtown Manhattan and the city stirred into motion, the scene outside the New York Hilton Midtown was shaped by a quiet that felt removable from time itself. Street lamps hummed in the pre-morning grey, and the world was in a state between sleep and activity, a stillness that held the promise of movement yet had not yet crossed the threshold into momentum. It was here, in this in-between space, that Luigi Mangione's actions played out like a slow unfolding sequence in a dream, deliberate, unhurried and almost ritualistic. He had left the hostel with his bicycle well before the city began its usual assault of noise and motion. That early routine, pedal, dismount, walk forward, glance up the avenue, repeated itself again and again. Each step seemed dipped in patience. Each pause held a quiet calculation. In the chill of a New York morning that carried hints of winter, his presence became a study in stillness, a figure framed against the muted rhythm of the city's awakening. Surveillance watched him with an almost hypnotic cadence. A man pacing the sidewalk, looping past lamplit storefronts, lingering at corners, retracing his own footsteps in quiet sequences that became familiar markers in the hours before the world around him fully stirred. No sudden bursts of movement punctuated his behavior. Instead, he repeated his pattern: forward, back, wait, watch. The calm on his face suggested deliberate engagement with the space around him, an almost meditative immersion in the small acts that carried weight only in hindsight. In the shadow of tall buildings and shuttered shops, his routine movements traced a rhythm that was both ordinary and unsettling. Bicycles hummed past on the adjacent avenue. A lone city bus whined its approach at long intervals. The distant rumble of subway trains pierced the silence in low, measured pulses. All these mundane beats drummed against Mangione's repetitive, measured steps, a pattern that, in its quiet repetition, set a tone that was as calm as it was charged with intent. To an outside observer, unaware of the events that would soon unfold, these motions would have appeared nearly indistinguishable from the way any early morning visitor might orient themselves in a new city. But in retrospect, once each sequence, each return to the same vantage point, became part of a larger arc, the pacing assumed a deeper significance. What at first seemed like an unremarkable series of movements gradually revealed itself to be a prelude, a patient rehearsal for an action that was neither rushed nor abrupt, but prepared with unyielding focus and measured calm. There was a fluidity to his motion that belied the gravity of what was to come. No frantic gestures, no restless shifting, just a slow, almost hypnotic blend of repetition and stillness, like a man rehearsing his own presence in space and time, testing boundaries of light and shadow, echo and silence. It was not chaos, it was preparation, a quiet yet intense forward motion that read like a series of breaths, arriving softly and leaving just as quietly, until the moment arrived that would break the rhythm altogether. This pacing, patient, unhurried, methodical in its serenity, serves as a reminder that intention can take shape not in bursts of frenzy, but in the repetition of ordinary motion, repeated until it forms a kind of quiet certainty that nothing else matters but what comes next. In the early hours of December 4th, 2024, the scene on West 54th Street, outside the New York Hilton Midtown, had the look of a city stirring awake, cabs idling at curbs, early buses easing onto avenues, pedestrians with coffee cups in hand. But at a specific corner near the hotel entrance, one figure stood out in ways that made little sense at first glance. Luigi Mangione, pacing with a quiet persistence that seemed to stitch his presence into the fabric of the street. What might have seemed like random motion was, in fact, a pattern that grew ever more distinct as the minutes stretched toward the moment he had chosen. Beginning around 5:52 a.m., surveillance footage showed Mangione stepping off the curb, pausing, and then retracing a few paces back toward the same spot. A series of movements that, if watched without context, could be mistaken for hesitation or casual waiting. But each forward step, followed by a backward return, seemed calculated, like iterations in a silent rehearsal. He did not wander, he looped, he did not stride, he measured. The pattern repeated itself with unfaltering consistency, and in this repetition, repeated crossings, repeated pauses, repeated returns to the same vantage point. Something in the rhythm began to take on an almost mechanical quality. Observing these sequences minute by minute reveals a man enacting the same set of motions again and again. He would move forward a few steps, then turn his head left and right, as if scanning toward the hotel entrance. Then, almost imperceptibly, he would shift slightly backward, retracing his own steps before pausing in near stillness. Occasionally, his hand brushed the strap of his backpack. Other times, he adjusted his hood or checked his wristwatch, eyes flicking toward the block ahead. To anyone else, these small gestures were ordinary, a common way to shake off cold or stretch limbs before a long wait. But viewed together, these repeated patterns established a cadence that was charged with anticipation. As more pedestrians began arriving, business commuters, delivery workers, morning walkers, Mangione's measured loops stayed the same. He neither joined the flow of foot traffic nor retreated from it. His movement became a constant in the equation of the street, an unbroken loop of steps that threaded back and forth through the same narrow radius, reinforcing a sense of intent that was invisible yet undeniable in hindsight. Each repetition felt like a beat in a silent clock, counting down to an unknown hour. By 6:30 a.m., the pattern was unmistakable, not chaotic, but deliberate, almost hypnotic in its calm constancy. It was the repetition itself that shaped the tension, not sudden action, not visible planning, but the constant renewal of the same small steps over and over again, building a quiet dread that only became clear with the knowledge of what was to come. In this way, the laneways and sidewalks of Midtown Manhattan held a presence that was still yet vibrating with unseen purpose, a routine reshaped into an instrument of foreboding that would culminate only minutes later. As the pre-dawn light deepened into the first grey glow of a Manhattan morning, there was nothing about the scene outside the Hilton Midtown to suggest an upcoming eruption of violence. Taxi engines idled, pedestrians crossed 6th Avenue with coffee in hand, delivery workers wheeled carts over crosswalks, and a city awakening carried on without pause. Yet at the same corner, where buses would soon snake their routes up 9th Avenue, and elevators would begin hoisting corporate workers to high office floors, one man stood, still and deliberate in his movement. And in watching him, you are led to a stark and unsettling question. What's more terrifying, rage in the moment, or patience over time? In most stories of violence, explosive emotion or sudden conflict appears as a rupture, a blinding flash of anger, a spontaneous eruption that shocks onlookers. But in the sequence of events that unfolded here, the danger was not grasped in a single moment of fury. Instead, it was woven into a tapestry of repeated steps, careful positioning, and calm immersion in routine movements that betrayed no outward sign of intent. Over minutes and hours, stillness became action, patience became readiness, and waiting became execution. This is not to justify what happened, but to acknowledge how slowly, quietly, and deceptively premeditation can take shape. In earlier chapters, we traced how Luigi Mangione arrived in New York, how he moved through a crowd with near invisibility, and how he repeated seeming mundane behaviors, looping beside curbs, checking the angle of approaching feet on pavement, returning to the same patch of sidewalk again and again. Each tiny motion mirrored the last, creating a rhythm that blended with the city's own pulse. And in that rhythm, there was a kind of patience that can feel ordinary until you consider what it implies: sustained attention to place, to timing, and to the precise point at which preparation becomes action. The dread here does not erupt like thunder. It seeps in like cold air under a door, unnoticed at first, then undeniably present. When people think of danger, they often imagine heated confrontation, emotional outbursts, or sudden conflict emerging from chaos. But what transpired on that block near West 54th Street was not born of explosion so much as of quiet calculation, deliberate, focused, and accumulative over a span of days and hours. That shift from patience into peril is what underlies the tension we feel now. A sense that the most threatening moments are not always loud, but sometimes quiet and unassuming until they reach their inevitable end. And this truth invites reflection that reaches beyond this story. It asks us to consider whether in life we pay enough attention to the slow build instead of just the climax. Do we watch only for violent disruption, or do we also see the prolonged gestures that signal the kind of intent that only becomes clear in hindsight? In Mangione's case, it was not a moment of rage that defined his actions, but a slow accumulation of choices that transformed preparation into reality. And so the question lingers: what is more frightening? An instant of fury or a long period of calm that hides its own purpose? If you've stayed with this narrative this far, witnessing not just the facts, but the texture of how events unfolded, from ordinary streets and quiet sidewalks to a moment that changed a life, then this story has done more than inform you. It has made you pause and reflect on the hidden patterns beneath apparent normalcy. Hit like so more people can see it. Because stories like this don't just recount events, they challenge us to consider the nature of human intent, the cadence of action, and the unseen threads that connect routine to consequence. And as we move into the next chapter, the moment when these quiet preparations break into action, keep this question in mind: is it the sudden rupture that frightens us most, or the patient footsteps that precede it? The winter morning in Midtown Manhattan was already turning from dark grey to cold light when Brian Robert Thompson stepped onto the sidewalk of West 54th Street, just blocks from the New York Hilton Midtown. The sky was muted, with early sun struggling through layers of cloud. Ahead of him stretched the broad sidewalk and the tall glass front of the Hilton, where an investor conference for UnitedHealthcare's parent company, United Health Group, was set to begin at 8 a.m. At that moment, everything about the street seemed ordinary. A bellman in a long coat held open the door of a car that had just stopped, and a delivery truck idled near the curb, its driver shifting boxes toward the hotel entrance. Thompson wore a tailored overcoat over his grey suit, a leather briefcase in hand, and the morning's first conference schedule tucked neatly inside a folder. To him, this was one more business morning, a familiar path he had walked in airports, downtown streets, and convention centers across the country throughout his career. This section of 6th Avenue, between West 53rd and West 54th Streets, was a busy cross-path for commuters, hotel guests, and early morning walkers. Construction scaffolding lined parts of the street corner, and pedestrians crossed in small groups toward the Hilton's glass doors. Taxi cabs pulsed into place at the curb as a city bus slowed to a stop 4 blocks north. Among this movement, Thompson's steps were steady, his gait unbroken, and his mind focused on the day's agenda as he made his way toward what he believed would be a routine meeting. He was not alone in the crowd, but in the blur of faces. Suited professionals, tourists with luggage, hotel staff with carts of towels and linens. Thompson's presence carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to both visibility and anonymity. He was visible due to his role, yet anonymous to the hundreds of strangers around him. No part of this block gave any hint that the situation was about to crystallize into one of the most shocking moments in recent American corporate history. Just a few feet ahead of him lay a moment that would break this expanding routine into something irreversible. A series of seconds that would be replayed, reviewed, and remembered long after the sidewalks reopened for business as usual. At approximately 6:44 a.m. on December 4th, 2024, Brian Robert Thompson made his way along West 54th Street toward the New York Hilton Midtown. The crisp morning air carried the scent of cold pavement and distant coffee carts, and the sidewalks were beginning to fill with a mix of hotel staff, conference attendees, and early morning commuters. Thompson had left the hotel where he was staying across the street, a short walk that he had taken dozens of times before in cities across the country. Today, however, he was en route to a gathering meant to mark another milestone in his career, the UnitedHealth Group annual investor meeting. His steps were measured and composed, a rhythm born of routine rather than hesitancy. He carried only his briefcase and a calm focus that many who knew him described as characteristic. A man grounded in purpose, accustomed to the demands of leadership and the cadence of executive responsibility. Grouped in small clusters near the Hilton's entrance were professionals in business attire already greeting one another, forming loose lines that shielded the morning sun's rising glow. Thompson's stride was purposeful, not hurried. As he crossed the span between parked taxis and hotel doormen arranging luggage, his mind was concentrated on the agenda ahead. Keynotes, shareholder questions, and strategic presentations critical to the company's future. It was an ordinary morning commitment for a man for whom such meetings were familiar territory. And yet the day's beginning felt grounded in the quiet confidence that had come to define him. To passers-by, he was another executive heading into a significant day of work. The weighted leather of his briefcase, the crisp crease in his coat, and the neutral expression on his face blended with the rhythm of Midtown's early pace, one foot in front of the other, tuned to the familiar choreography of urban life. But beneath this calm exterior, no hint of caution or suspicion appeared in his movements. He did not glance over his shoulder. He did not accelerate his pace. In the seconds before what would happen next, Thompson remained resolute in his stride, unaware that the moment was already suspended on the edge of an irreversible turn. As Brian Robert Thompson continued his measured steps toward the New York Hilton Midtown entrance, the ordinary rhythm of Midtown Manhattan was pierced in an instant that no one saw coming. At approximately 6:44 a.m. on December 4th, 2024, Thompson, unaware of the shadow behind him, was approached from behind by a figure who had waited in place for that precise moment. The assailant stood across the street before stepping forward, covering the short distance with a quietness that belied the violence about to unfold. Then came the shot. Without warning, the gunman raised a suppressed 9mm pistol and fired directly at Thompson. The shots struck him in the back and his right leg, each impact sending a jolt of pain rippling through his body. The sound of each round was muffled but unmistakable, enough to draw gasps from bystanders and trigger chaos on the sidewalk outside the hotel. Thompson staggered, his coat shifting under the force of the blow, but he did not collapse immediately. Instead, instinct took hold as confusion rippled through the small cluster of early morning pedestrians watching in horror. From behind, he had no time to brace, no moment to turn, and no opportunity to react before the violence hit him. 2 distinct wounds told the story of quick precision. The shot to his back halting his forward stride, the one to his leg forcing his body to buck in pain, both strikes undermining his ability to stand. In those split seconds, the world around him blurred. Headlights of passing cars, startled shouts, a rolling suitcase left askew on the pavement. All converged on a single point of disruption that would redefine the day for everyone present. Many eyewitnesses later described the scene as surreal, a moment that began with corporate promise and ended in an unthinkable spill of blood on the sidewalk, where the morning had seemed unremarkable only moments before. The attack was not random. It was an ambush born of planning and patience, carried out with sudden, devastating certainty. Thompson's walking pace, once so unremarkable, became forever fixed in memory as the moment just before everything changed. In the chilling aftermath of the firing, the gunman did not stand and watch. Instead, he cleared the pistol's action, a motion captured on nearby surveillance cameras, then turned and vanished into the early morning sprawl of Midtown Manhattan. What remained on the sidewalk were the echoes of gunfire, Thompson's fallen posture, and the first signs of frantic movement as the city's response began to unfold. The seconds after the shots rang out on West 54th Street were marked by sudden confusion and frantic movement that rippled through the early morning crowd. Pedestrians who had been walking toward the entrance of the New York Hilton Midtown froze at the sound, a sequence of muffled reports that shattered the usual calm of arrival traffic and hotel staff preparing for the day. Within moments, the area turned from a scene of routine motion into one charged with urgency and shock. As witnesses registered what had just occurred, people reacted differently in the chaos that followed. Some instinctively ducked behind cars and nearby columns, breath catching in disbelief. Others rushed toward Thompson's fallen form, instinctively drawn by concern for the man they had only moments earlier seen walking purposefully to his day's work. Cell phones appeared at once, both to dial emergency services and to capture images of the disruption that had erupted on a sidewalk that had been calm only seconds before. The first 911 calls came almost immediately, their urgency clear in the voices of those calling from beside Thompson's prone figure. Within minutes, police vehicles with flashing lights pulled up along the curb, officers leaping from their cars and sprinting toward the hotel entrance as sirens wailed into the morning stillness. Some of the people who had gathered in shock were ushered away by officers trying to clear space for emergency personnel. Others remained, unable to fully pull themselves away from the scene that had changed so rapidly and so completely. New York City Fire Department units were not far behind the initial police response. Paramedics knelt beside Thompson, their voices purposeful as they assessed his injuries and began stabilizing him for transport. The shock of seeing a life-threatening wound so close to a hotel entrance intended for welcoming visitors struck responders with dual urgency and professionalism. There was no time for hesitation, only decisive action. Stretchers were brought out, medical supplies unpacked, and early attempts at first aid carried out with precision amid the hubbub of uniforms and equipment. Meanwhile, the street itself took on the appearance of a scene cordoned off in haste. Police lines were drawn, tape unfurled in yellow strands that created a boundary between the site of the shooting and the flurry of activity just outside it. Reporters, already on the edges of the Hilton grounds for the upcoming investor meeting, lifted cameras toward the area as onlookers craned their necks to see past the police barricades. A palpable tension hung in the air as ambulances arrived and doors opened, readying the transfer of the wounded executive to a nearby hospital. In the midst of it all, officers on the scene attempted to gather statements from shaken bystanders, their voices steady as they tried to piece together the fragmented accounts of witnesses who had seen only brief segments of the attack. Some described Thompson's fall, others spoke of the gunman's sudden departure. Many recounted the shock of the moment, the disbelief that such violence had erupted so close to the pulse of Manhattan's normal rhythm. Emergency medical services eventually moved Thompson onto a stretcher and into an ambulance, where paramedics continued critical care as the vehicle sped toward Mount Sinai West Hospital, the same facility where he would soon be pronounced dead. Residents of Midtown Manhattan, hotel guests and commuters were left confronting an immediate and visceral reminder. Even in the center of a city alive with motion and routine, life-altering violence can intrude with no more notice than a handful of muffled reports amid the swirl of emergency. Activity outside the New York Hilton Midtown in the minutes after the attack on Brian Robert Thompson. Detectives methodically examined the area where the shots were fired. Officers crouched down on the pavement, lifting fragments of brass, fragments of evidence that told a story far more intentional than random violence. 3 9mm shell casings were collected not only as physical remnants of the attack, but as bearers of a message that would later become central to the investigation. On each of those spent casings, and on a corresponding set of live rounds found nearby, was a single word written in bold script: delay, deny, and deposed. These were not accidental markings. Investigators, documenting each piece of physical evidence, noted that the words had been inscribed deliberately, one per cartridge, as though the gunman wished to attach significance to the ammunition itself. The significance of the words soon drew attention, because they echoed a phrase often used by critics of the American health insurance industry: delay, deny, defend. The phrase describes the pattern, according to consumer advocates and legal analysts, of tactics used by insurers to postpone, refuse, or contest coverage decisions, especially in high-stakes claims contexts. In the days following the shooting, police publicly acknowledged they were exploring whether the inscribed words might signal a motive tied to long-standing public frustration with health insurance practices. In many ways, the presence of those marked casings transformed them from mere detritus of a violent act into symbols that raised deeper questions about the meanings attached to the shooting. Was the gunman attempting to communicate something larger than the act itself? An indictment, a protest, or a stark statement against an industry that had become a flashpoint for resentment? Detectives could not immediately confirm the motive, but the markings ensured that conversation followed the shooting almost as quickly as the news of the attack itself. For bystanders and first responders, the words on the casings were almost surreal. Small handwritten messages on hard brass, stark in contrast with the cold steel of a weapon and the harshness of what had just occurred. Yet to analysts, the fact that such terms were left etched on evidence raised the possibility that the violence was as much a symbolic act as it was a physical one, linking the individual moment of horror to broader debates about industry conduct and public trust. In the days that followed, news coverage repeatedly referenced the unusual markings, noting their similarity to industry-related criticisms and the broader conversations unfolding around access to care, cost disputes, and corporate accountability. The story of those 3 casings, each bearing a single charged word, would later become inseparable from the narrative of the shooting itself. In the moments after the shots rang out at approximately 6:44 a.m., on December 4th, 2024, the emotional landscape around Brian Robert Thompson shifted instantly from routine to trauma. 1 second, he was walking toward the entrance of the New York Hilton Midtown on his way to an investor meeting. The next, he was recoiling in pain, struggling for balance as the reality of what had just happened crashed over him. Witnesses later described that instant as a rupture, not predicted, not hinted at, but arriving with a shocking abruptness that seized everyone present by surprise. Pedestrians who'd been chatting with colleagues or sipping their coffee froze as Thompson staggered and fell onto the cold pavement. In the chaotic blur that followed, there was no sense of time passing slowly. Instead, everything seemed compressed, condensed into a single disorienting span of seconds, where instincts took over but comprehension lagged far behind. A companion who had been stepping forward to greet Thompson mid-stride instead found herself crouched beside him, her voice trembling as she called for help, her eyes reflecting both shock and urgency. The suddenness of the attack plunged the street into confusion. Hotel staff sprinted out from behind service doors, voices raised, not in greeting, but in alarm. Taxi drivers slammed vehicle doors and stepped onto sidewalks to see what had happened. Bystanders, unprepared for violence in a place so public and so ordinary, stood rooted for a heartbeat before plunging into instinctive action, dialing emergency services, calling out for assistance, or simply covering their mouths in disbelief. For Thompson himself, the transition was bewildering. A man known to close associates as composed and grounded, someone who had faced boardrooms, negotiations, and high-stakes decisions, was suddenly reduced to someone fighting to remain conscious, to make sense of a trauma that had no immediate explanation. Paramedics later recounted that when they reached him, his breathing was shallow and urgent, his eyes searching not just for physical support, but for context, for understanding of how a morning that had begun like any other could end in such a debilitating injury. The helplessness felt by those around him echoed across the crowd. People instinctively wanted to take action, to fix what had happened. Yet the reality was that nothing in that moment could undo what had just occurred. The world did not pause, but it felt as though it should have. Passers-by looked at one another with wide eyes, seeking confirmation that others had registered the same transformation of the moment, from mundane to tragic. Yet each person saw their own disbelief reflected in everyone else's gaze. Responders' voices were crisp and determined, but even their professionalism could not mask the rupture between what had been expected for that December morning and what was rapidly unfolding on a busy block in Midtown Manhattan. Police radios crackled with updates. Sirens blared into the encroaching daylight, and the sight of gurneys on the sidewalk, a vehicle to carry Thompson away, became an unbearable symbol of how swiftly life's script can be rewritten. When the ambulance doors closed and paramedics began life-saving measures within the vehicle, the sense of finality settled in around those who had watched in stunned silence. The brief encounter that had changed everything, a walk across a familiar sidewalk, a heartbeat of calm, a sudden act of intentional violence, was already beginning to feel like something removed from the fabric of ordinary life, as though the city's motion had stepped aside to allow a moment that could never be unwritten. This emotional shift, from composed routine to acute helplessness and the stark weight of final consequences, would later shape how Thompson's family, friends, and colleagues remembered that morning, not as a transitional moment before a meeting, but as the point where normalcy and loss intersected with unfiltered impact. If someone had told you that a respected executive walking toward an important meeting on a calm Manhattan sidewalk would soon be struck down by gunfire, could anything have stopped him? When we reflect on the moments leading up to the attack on Brian Robert Thompson, the question cuts across what we believed was normal and what actually occurred. Thompson was in New York City on December 4th, 2024, to attend the UnitedHealth Group annual investor meeting, and at around 6:44 a.m. he walked along West 54th Street toward the New York Hilton Midtown, unaware that his path would soon become the site of a devastating and fatal encounter. In the hours before the shooting, nothing about that morning suggested danger. The city was entering its routine rhythm, slow at first, then building into motion as commuters and early morning workers navigated sidewalks and crosswalks. Thompson's steps were steady and composed, guided by familiarity with the location and his purpose for the day. He crossed West 54th Street, a brief distance from his hotel to the conference venue, surrounded by other pedestrians who were going about their own routines. Everything appeared ordinary, until it was not. Could anything have signaled what was coming? In hindsight, patterns emerge. The presence of a figure waiting across the street, the unusual stillness of that figure, movements, and later the discovery of 3 shell casings marked with the words deny, delay, and depose. Police noted these markings could reflect the suspect's motives as they echo criticisms of the healthcare industry's tactics, though the motive itself would remain under investigation. Yet in the seconds before the attack, those details were invisible. The street hum was beginning to rise. Taxis pulled near the curb. Doormen stood ready at hotel entrances. And Thompson's focus was on the day ahead, not on what might lurk in the shadows of the familiar. There was no loud argument, no obvious confrontation, no shouted warning before the assailant stepped forward from across the street and fired. In that sudden rupture, the ordinary became irrevocably altered. Passers-by crumpled to the pavement, some frozen in disbelief, others acting on instinct as sirens grew louder and emergency responders streamed onto the scene. In the span of a few breaths, a moment that seemed ordinary and calm, everything changed, leaving in its wake a question that lingers not just for those present, but for everyone who has ever walked without fear. If someone had told you this would happen, could anything have stopped it? When the shots struck Brian Robert Thompson outside the New York Hilton Midtown on the morning of December 4th, 2024, it was not merely a moment of violence. It was the abrupt end of a life defined by family, purpose, and decades of dedication to work and loved ones. In the hours and days afterward, friends, colleagues, and family members shared glimpses of the man behind the title, revealing a life far richer and more grounded than the headlines could ever capture. Thompson was 50 years old, a father and a husband whose schedule for that morning included an investor meeting he had helped shape from afar. He lived in Minnesota with his family and had spent years navigating the complexity of healthcare financing, building relationships, and guiding large teams with the steady composure that defined his leadership style. In the moments before the shooting, there was no indication in his demeanor or his pace that this walk across West 54th Street was anything but another routine business morning. He left the hotel where he had stayed, a familiar route shared by executives and travelers alike, and crossed the sidewalk with steps attuned to the rhythm of the city's early motion. In those ordinary strides was the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to responsibility and calm focus, not someone bracing for harm. The transition from that composed walk to the violence that struck him was so swift and unanticipated that those nearest could only grasp its impact in fragments. The sudden cry, the instinctive rush of strangers toward him, the sharp urgency in emergency responders' voices. For Thompson, a life structured around thoughtful decision-making and measured pacing collapsed into a sequence of moments spent fighting for survival. Although he was rushed to Mount Sinai West Hospital after the attack, he succumbed to his injuries shortly before 7:12 a.m., less than half an hour after the attack occurred. For those who knew him, the reality of that final morning was almost impossible to reconcile with the man they remembered. His calm leadership, his consistency in routine, and his patient commitment to family and work were not attributes one would associate with someone likely to be targeted in such a way. In statements released after his death, colleagues and public officials alike emphasized not just his professional accomplishments, but his humanity. The way he engaged with people around him, offered steady support in challenging times, and balanced corporate life with personal warmth. Friends described him as someone who pushed forward even when facing pressure, someone who could sit through hours of detailed discussion and still find time to check in with his loved ones. That morning, of all mornings, began as countless others had, with purpose, calm execution of plans, and the quiet expectation of another day's work. It ended not with the conclusion of meetings and decisions, but with the echo of irreversible consequence. In remembering Thompson, those closest to him focused on the life he lived rather than the act that ended it. They spoke of his legacy as a leader, a father, and a husband whose presence was steady and whose absence was deeply felt. This perspective, respectful, human-centered, and evocative of the fullness of his character, stands in stark contrast to the violence of that sidewalk, and serves as a reminder that behind every headline is a life of relationships, routines, and purpose. In the moments after the attack on Brian Robert Thompson outside the New York Hilton Midtown, the assailant vanished into the early morning streets of Manhattan with the same quiet determination that had marked his preparation. Soon after firing the shots that struck Thompson, the figure now known to authorities as Luigi Mangione mounted a bicycle and pedaled northward, crossing corridors of traffic and weaving through blocks of Midtown before entering Central Park, an urban labyrinth where a maze of paths and hidden lanes offered an opportunity to disappear in plain sight. The image of Mangione riding his bike through the park was the last confirmed sighting of him in New York, a deliberate exit strategy that capitalized on the early hour, when pedestrian traffic was light and the park's winding paths created a natural buffer from direct observation. In the chill of an early December morning, with the city just coming to life, his retreat was unremarkable in outward appearance, and yet highly effective in concealing his next moves. Once clear of Central Park's edges, Mangione abandoned the bicycle, a means of silent approach turned now into a silent getaway, and boarded a local bus that would carry him out of the dense Manhattan grid. Investigators believed he later took a long-distance coach heading westward, traversing state lines, and leaving New York City behind as the morning grew into daylight. From bus terminal to terminal, his journey carried him hundreds of miles from the street where Thompson was killed. At one point, evidence suggested, he briefly stopped in smaller towns, at times blending into cafes and transit hubs while keeping a low profile. Eventually, his path led him to Altoona, Pennsylvania, a city far removed from the glare of Manhattan's skyline and the investor conference that had drawn Thompson. It was here, in an ordinary restaurant chain frequented by travelers, that his flight would ultimately come to an end. 5 days after the deadly attack on Brian Robert Thompson, outside the New York Hilton Midtown, law enforcement officials were still piecing together leads in the sprawling manhunt for the suspect. On the morning of December 9th, 2024, investigators received a crucial break when a worker at a MC Donald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania, recognized a customer from widely circulated images released by the NYPD and called police, believing the man resembled the picture of the person wanted in connection with Thompson's killing. Altoona is more than 280 miles west of New York City, but the city's relative quiet on that morning provided a stark contrast to the bustling Manhattan streets where the crime had occurred. Officers arrived at the restaurant and found Luigi Mangione sitting at a table near the restrooms, wearing a coat and beanie, as described by the employee who had made the call. What began as a simple call from someone who thought they might have seen the suspect quickly turned into a decisive moment in the case. Officers approached Mangione under the pretext of a routine check, initially questioning him about his presence in Altoona and asking what had brought him there. When it became clear that the identification he offered was false, they arrested him. First on forgery and false identification charges tied to the fake license he was carrying. Only after that arrest did law enforcement begin examining the rest of Mangione's belongings more closely, setting in motion the discovery of evidence that would directly link him to the Midtown Manhattan shooting. At that point, the investigation shifted completely. A fugitive case turned into a full criminal prosecution as officers prepared to transfer him back to New York to face charges in connection with Thompson's killing. Immediately after Luigi Mangione was taken into custody at MC Donald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania, officers began searching the contents of the backpack he had with him at the time of his arrest. What they uncovered would become key to connecting him to the attack on Brian Robert Thompson and solidifying the charges that would follow. First, police found a firearm and suppressor that matched the type of weapon used in the Midtown Manhattan shooting. The pistol and attached suppressor, consistent with the suppressed 9mm device believed to have fired the rounds that wounded Thompson, were recovered from inside Mangione's bag alongside ammunition. Also inside were multiple identification documents, including the same fake New Jersey driver's license that had allowed Mangione to check into the Manhattan hostel under an alias before the shooting. Officers recovered additional falsified IDs, as well as an American passport, all of which showed different names and forms of identification, suggesting a deliberate attempt to obscure his identity and movements. Perhaps most striking to investigators was a written document, described in court filings and press reports as a manifesto. This handwritten statement, found among Mangione's belongings, addressed perceived grievances with the American healthcare system and corporate policy decisions. New York law enforcement officials later characterized the document as offering insight into his mindset and potential motive, and excerpts were cited by prosecutors during pretrial hearings. Additionally, police found maps, notebooks, and detailed notes that appeared to include travel planning, route identifiers, and survival reminders. Some of these writings mentioned escape strategies and logistical considerations for avoiding capture, further illustrating that Mangione had not only prepared for the deadly act, but also for the period that might follow it. The discovery of these items, the weapon matching the one used in the attack, the false identification, and the handwritten document expressing hostile ideas, became pivotal in linking Mangione directly to Thompson's killing. Armed with these materials, prosecutors in both Pennsylvania and New York framed their cases around not just the physical evidence tying him to the scene, but the circumstantial evidence that helped outline his intentions and actions in the days leading up to the assault. After Luigi Mangione's arrest in Altoona, Pennsylvania, the legal proceedings that followed swiftly expanded into one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent U.S. history. On December 9, 2024, local law enforcement charged Mangione with baseline offenses tied to his arrest: carrying an unlicensed firearm, falsifying identification, and possession of instruments of crime. But those initial charges were only the first layer of a much larger legal effort to hold him accountable for the murder of Brian Robert Thompson. Within hours of his capture, prosecutors in Manhattan filed more serious accusations that placed Mangione at the center of a major state criminal case. He was charged with second-degree murder, multiple counts of illegal weapons possession, and forgery related to the false identification he used to travel and check into a hostel in New York City before the shooting. A few days later, on December 17, 2024, a New York State grand jury returned a set of 11 state charges that broadened the legal framework against Mangione. Among these were counts of second-degree murder, several levels of criminal weapons possession, and other related offenses tied directly to the planning and execution of the attack. At the same time, federal prosecutors filed 4 separate charges in the Southern District of New York, including counts of murder through use of a firearm-related offenses, and stalking across state lines, a combination of offenses that under U.S. law allowed the Department of Justice to assert jurisdiction and pursue a more expansive case. In April 2025, the Attorney General directed federal prosecutors to pursue the death penalty in the case, asserting that Mangione's actions met the criteria for capital prosecution under statutes related to the use of a firearm during the commission of a violent crime. However, in January 2026, a federal judge ruled that 2 charges necessary to make Mangione eligible for the federal death penalty were legally flawed and dismissed them, effectively preventing prosecutors from seeking execution as a sentence. Despite this setback for the capital case, the remaining federal counts, including stalking and related firearms charges, still carry severe penalties, including life imprisonment if Mangione is convicted. The state murder charges likewise carry a maximum sentence of life behind bars under New York law. Pre-trial hearings in both jurisdictions have been marked by legal maneuvering, including defense efforts to suppress evidence seized at the time of Mangione's arrest, and challenges to the admissibility of handwritten writings found in his possession. These proceedings serve as a prelude to the trials that prosecutors hope will provide resolution to the Thompson family and the public. Across both federal and state courts, Mangione has pleaded not guilty to all charges, maintaining that he did not commit the crimes as alleged. His legal team has argued against the introduction of certain evidence and has contested aspects of the prosecution's case on procedural grounds. With state trial dates scheduled and federal jury selection set for later in the year, the legal battles ahead promise to be lengthy, complex, and consequential, touching on issues of criminal intent, interstate prosecution, and the appropriate boundaries of punishment under American law. In the weeks following his arrest and the discovery of incriminating evidence tied to the killing of Brian Robert Thompson, Luigi Mangione appeared in multiple courts to answer for the crimes alleged against him. At his arraignments in both New York State and federal court, Mangione entered pleas of not guilty to all charges, emphatically rejecting the idea that he was responsible for the attack that had taken Thompson's life. In New York Supreme Court, Mangione was arraigned on the state charges, including second-degree murder and multiple counts of criminal weapons possession, and pleaded not guilty, setting the stage for a trial that prosecutors and defense attorneys both acknowledged would be highly scrutinized. Shortly afterward, in federal court in the Southern District of New York, Mangione also entered a not guilty plea on the 4 federal counts against him. These federal charges included stalking, resulting in death, and firearms offenses tied to the cross-state nature of the act and the use of a weapon during the alleged crime. Despite earlier attempts by federal prosecutors to seek the death penalty, a judge later ruled that counts necessary to pursue capital punishment were legally inapplicable, leaving only stalking and related charges that still carry a potential sentence of life imprisonment if Mangione is convicted. At both arraignments, Mangione stood composed as the not guilty pleas were formally recorded, and the courtroom exchanges underscored the seriousness of the legal battles ahead. Court observers noted that the defense team continued to contest the admissibility of key evidence, including writings and items seized at the time of arrest, arguing procedural and constitutional issues that could shape what the jury ultimately hears once the trials begin. These not guilty pleas did more than assert Mangione's denial of guilt. They marked the transition of the case from a factual investigation into a complex legal confrontation in which both sides would present detailed arguments about intent, evidence, and the interpretation of laws ranging from state homicide statutes to federal interstate stalking provisions. In the wake of Brian Robert Thompson's killing, the nation's public response was deeply divided, reflecting not only shock at the violence, but also broader tensions tied to modern healthcare, social media culture, and political identity. The event did not elicit a uniform reaction. Instead, voices across the country ranged from grief and condemnation to anger, criticism, and even hostility directed at the industry Thompson led. Many Americans reacted with disbelief and sorrow at the loss of a husband, father, and executive who had shaped a major healthcare institution. Public officials from both parties issued statements condemning the attack and offering condolences to Thompson's family and colleagues, emphasizing that violence is never an acceptable response to grievance. At the same time, the broader public discussion, especially on social media platforms, took on an extraordinary intensity. Posts ranged from heartfelt condolences for Thompson's loved ones to posts expressing deep frustration with the U.S. healthcare system and the practices of major insurers. Some commentators framed the attack as symbolic of widespread resentment toward health insurance policies that many Americans feel have contributed to financial hardship or barriers to care. This sentiment went beyond simple policy debate. In the immediate days after the shooting, posts on platforms like X, Reddit, and TikTok included sharp criticism of industry practices, and a small faction of users even expressed contempt or celebratory remarks about Thompson's death. News reports noted that many reactions did not extend traditional sympathy toward Thompson, but instead reflected broader public anger toward high insurance costs, claim denials, and perceived inequities in access to care. Polling conducted shortly after the incident underscored this complexity. While a majority of adults considered the killing unacceptable, younger voters were notably more likely to say they found the act acceptable or somewhat acceptable, and many respondents pointed to systemic issues in the healthcare industry as factors contributing to their reactions. Among experts and commentators, this split was interpreted as part of a larger conversation about how the structure of the U.S. healthcare system and the role of insurers can shape public sentiment. Some argued that venting frustration on social media was an outlet for broader economic and social anxieties, while others warned against normalizing or justifying violent acts as a response to policy grievances. In contrast to the reactions steeped in grievance or resentment, many citizens, advocacy groups, and policymakers remained steadfast in their belief that violence against individuals, regardless of their position or industry affiliation, is inherently wrong, and that meaningful change in policy should be pursued through democratic and legal channels, rather than through harm. In the aftermath of the killing of Brian Robert Thompson, broader issues came into sharp relief. Not only the unfolding legal case against Luigi Mangione, but deeply rooted frustrations many Americans hold toward the country's healthcare system, and the moral questions that arise when that frustration reaches a boiling point. Across the nation, the reaction to Thompson's death revealed how intense discontent with industry practices can coexist with condemnation of violence, and how those feelings sometimes blur into one another in public discourse. For years, many people in the United States have expressed dissatisfaction with the structure and outcomes of the country's private health insurance system, particularly when it comes to steep costs, claim denials, and the financial strain that medical care can impose on families. Polling in the weeks after the attack found that a majority of adults believed that factors tied to insurance practices, including coverage denial and the profits made by insurers, bore at least a moderate amount of responsibility for the climate of anger surrounding the story. Experts noted that these frustrations do not justify violence, but they do help explain why the shooting touched a raw nerve in the national consciousness. Academics pointing to widespread experiences of denied or delayed care observed that stories of people struggling under the weight of medical costs are common in countless families' lives, sometimes leading to heartbreak and financial devastation. These shared experiences of frustration help explain why some individuals spoke with intense emotion about the broader system in the aftermath of the killing. At the same time, observers and commentators raised questions about the moral boundaries of frustration. Anger over systemic inequities can be an impetus for reform and debate, but it becomes distressing for many when that anger crosses into impulses toward harmful actions. Public discussions reflected this tension. Some voiced sympathetic understanding for frustration rooted in personal hardship, while others warned against allowing rage to blur the line between advocacy and justification of extreme conduct. Amid this complex backdrop, polling also showed that a majority of Americans, including those critical of the healthcare system, viewed the attack on Thompson as unacceptable, even if they understood the emotional roots of widespread dissatisfaction. Younger adults, in particular, were more divided, with some expressing more ambivalence toward the killing, while still recognizing deep concerns about access, affordability, and the fairness of insurance practices. The juxtaposition of sympathy for victims of systemic problems and outrage over a violent act underscored a broader question facing the nation. When collected, frustration grows intense. Where do we draw the line between righteous demand for change and actions that violate the fundamental rule of law and respect for human life? This question was not merely academic. It became a central theme in the weeks and months following Thompson's death, shaping conversations on social media, in legislative hearings, and around kitchen table discussions in communities across the country. In this space between critique of institutions and the ethical limits of individual response, the story of Thompson's killing became intertwined with a larger national dialogue about health policy, public grievance, and the channels through which meaningful reform should and must occur. In the wake of the killing of Brian Robert Thompson, a question surfaced that pierced deeper than headlines or court filings. When frustration turns into justification, where do we draw the line? The attack did more than take a life. It brought into stark relief simmering public discontent with the healthcare system and what many perceive as its inherent inequities. Around the country, discussions that once focused on policy disagreements and insurance coverage denials expanded into debates about anger, accountability, and the boundaries of human action. For years, critics have argued that major health insurers engage in practices that delay, deny, and defend claims, a phrase widely used to describe tactics that can leave patients waiting, frustrated, or without critical care. At the scene of Thompson's shooting, investigators found spent ammunition marked with the words delay, deny, and depose, words that drew attention precisely because they echoed criticism held by many about the structure of insurance delivery in the United States. That symbolic detail, a stark message etched into the physical evidence of a violent act, forced the public to reckon with how deeply feelings run regarding the nation's healthcare system. In some quarters of online discussion, individuals vented personal stories of claim denials and financial hardship, framing the industry's conduct as emblematic of broader systemic failure. Yet even as these frustrations gained traction, the idea of turning criticism into justification for violence raised moral questions that were hard to escape. Many voices weighed in with clear condemnation of Thompson's killing, emphasizing that anger over policy or practice does not legitimize harm against individuals. Polls taken after the attack showed that while some people could understand the frustration behind criticisms of insurers, a majority of adults still found the act of killing unacceptable, even if they acknowledged systemic problems. Herein lies the tension. It is one thing to articulate dissatisfaction or to advocate for change within democratic and legal systems. It is another to cross a boundary into acts that end lives. The question, where do we draw the line, became not just rhetorical, but a central theme in media commentary, scholarly essays, public forums, and conversations in workplaces and homes alike. Some argued that the presence of the words on the casings served as a grim metaphor for public sentiment, that too many felt unheard in their struggles with insurance coverage and mounting medical costs. Others warned that anchoring violence to societal frustration risks normalizing actions that undermine the rule of law and respect for human life. In the end, the lingering question was not simply about one individual's act or one community's anger. It was about society's collective responsibility, how to channel deeply felt grievances into constructive change without eroding the moral boundaries that separate advocacy from harm. Where frustration becomes justification is not just a legal inquiry, but a test of national conscience. As the legal battles continue and the nation reflects on the killing of Brian Robert Thompson, the echoes of that morning on December 4th, 2024 have not faded. A respected executive, father and leader struck down on a sidewalk outside his hotel in Manhattan. His death sparked conversations that reached far beyond legal proceedings into the very heart of national discourse. Some responses were filled with sympathy and grief for Thompson and his family, while others revealed deep-seated anger and resentment toward the healthcare system and those who lead it. Polling conducted after the attack showed a wide range of public sentiment, with a majority of American adults finding the killing unacceptable, even as younger voters were more divided. A reflection of how complicated and charged these issues can be. Yet this story is about more than a crime, more than court dates and trials. It is about the lessons we draw from tragedy, and how we choose to respond when frustration with institutions collides with the lives of real people. When frustration turns into justification for harm, we are forced to ask a deeper question. Where do we draw the line between passionate advocacy for change and actions that cross moral boundaries that have guided societies for generations? This narrative has carried you from a seemingly ordinary morning, through the planning and execution of an act that stunned a nation, into the courtroom and the court of public opinion. At each step, we've examined not just what happened, but why it resonated so deeply. Americans voiced outrage, empathy, hurt, disbelief, and in some corners unsettling approval. Evidence that public debate about healthcare access, cost and fairness runs deep and uncontained. But no matter where you fall on these debates, one truth remains. Violence is never a legitimate means of redressing policy disagreements or systemic frustrations. Holding that principle is not about dismissing concerns. It's about preserving the dignity of human life and the integrity of constructive dialogue. That's the lesson policymakers, communities, and individuals alike are still grappling with months after that December morning. Before we close this chapter of the story, let me ask you to think about this. What lesson did you take from all of this? Was it a reminder about the cost of division, a concern about healthcare policy, a reflection on how we debate ideas in public, or something entirely different? Leave a comment with your thoughts. Your perspective matters, especially on topics that shape not just headlines, but the way we understand our shared world. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think, subscribe so you won't miss the next in-depth real-life case we break down together. There's more to explore, and your voice adds depth to these conversations.